Okay, so we made our piping, and I want to talk a little bit about putting the piping on the edge of the quilt right before you put the binding on. But when we are putting binding on the edge of our quilt, that 1/4 inch seam allowance is really important. And so that is also true if you are wanting to put piping on the edge. That 1/4 inch is really important. So we're going to show you how you do that. We're going to take the piping tool. One thing to notice on the piping tool is that you've got a 3/8, 5/8, half, and a 1/4 inch seam allowance to choose from. And turning it over, what you have is a nice groove that cording is going to go right into. So we made our piping, so the seam allowance doesn't really matter when we're making the actual piping. And then we're going to slide it over the top of the piping that we just made, and see how that piping, or that cording rather, is sliding right into that groove. So you have that in there really tight, and then you're going to just take your rotary cutter and zip off that excess. And so now what you've got is piping with a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that when you have your quilt and you're going to lay that on the edge of your quilt, we can lay that right on the edge of the quilt. I'm going to overlap those on the corner, and I'm going to basically have those raw edges together, maybe show just a sliver of the quilt underneath so I can keep that seam allowance nice and consistent. And I'm going to sew that piping on with a little bit longer seam allowance. And then we can put our binding right over the top of it. Another thing I want to show you is on this quilt right here, notice the double row of piping. And I love things that look like they were really hard, but they were actually really easy. And how we're going to accomplish that is I have another row of, or another piece of piping that I made, and I'm going to choose the 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to turn it over, I'm going to find that 3/8 inch seam allowance, and see how I'm going to slide that back and forth to make sure that that cording is in there. And then I'm going to zip off that excess. So now I've got piping with a nice 3/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to lay the piping with the 3/8 inch seam allowance down. You can use your zipper foot if you want to sew that on, or just a regular piecing foot. A little bit longer stitch length, and basically you're just going to tack that down. And then when that is sewn down, I'm going to lay that 1/4 inch right on top of it. And I'm going to sew that piping on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you're going to put your binding right over the top of that. And that's going to give you this nice double row of piping right next to the binding. And it's not any harder to put on than that one layer is. So if you want to order the Tensisters Piping Tool, go to tensisters.com.